The morning the laughter stopped was the morning Savitri truly understood what silence meant. For more than 40 years her home had been filled with the steady rhythm of her husband's voice, clearing his throat before speaking, humming old folk songs while fixing tools, laughing loudly at his own simple jokes. When he passed away after a sudden illness, the silence that followed felt heavier than grief itself. It settled into the corners of the house, into the wooden beams, into her bones. The first few days were crowded with relatives, rituals, and murmured condolences. People held her hands and said, "Be strong." She nodded politely. Strength was not something she had to perform. It was something life had already carved into her through decades of hardship. But when the last visitor left and the courtyard gate clicked shut, she stood alone in the doorway and felt the world shift. She still woke up before sunrise. Old habits do not disappear just because hearts break. She swept the yard, sprinkled water to settle the dust, and drew a small rangoli at the entrance like she always had. She boiled tea in the dented steel pot and poured it into 2 cups before remembering. For several mornings she could not stop herself. She would stare at the second cup, steam rising into empty air, and then slowly pour it back into the pot. Her son had already moved to the city years earlier, chasing better opportunities. He called as soon as he heard the news and rushed home for the funeral. He cried like a child, his head in her lap, apologizing for not being there more often. She stroked his hair and told him not to blame himself. "Your father was proud of you," she said. "He always wanted you to fly higher than we ever could." When it was time for him to return to the city, she packed food for his journey and smiled bravely as the bus disappeared down the road. After that, the calls came every few days, then once a week, then sometimes only when he remembered late at night. He was busy, she understood. The city demanded energy and time in ways the village never did. She never told him how long the evenings felt. She never mentioned the way shadows stretched across the walls and made her heart uneasy. Instead, she asked about his work, whether he was eating properly, whether he was sleeping enough. During the day, children from the neighborhood often ran into her courtyard. They knew she kept jaggery in a small tin and stories in her memory. She told them tales her grandmother had told her, about clever birds, brave queens, and foolish kings who learned humility. When they laughed, her eyes sparkled again. For a few precious moments, the silence loosened its grip. But night was different. Night exposed truth. She would sit on her old wooden chair with her husband's framed photograph resting on her lap. The glass had a small crack on one corner, but she refused to replace it. Imperfections, she believed, carried history. She spoke to the photo softly, updating him about the village gossip, about the rising price of vegetables, about their son's promotion. Sometimes she imagined he answered. There were nights when tears slipped out before she could stop them. She wiped them quickly, almost embarrassed, though no one was there to see. She was not crying because she felt abandoned. She was crying because love does not end simply because a life does. It lingers, stretching across time, making absence feel sharp. Yet she did not allow sorrow to harden her. Each morning she chose kindness deliberately. She shared vegetables from her small garden with neighbors who struggled. She sat beside sick elders and fed them spoonfuls of soup. She blessed brides, comforted widows, and encouraged students before exams. People began to say, "If you need peace, sit with Savitri." What no one fully saw was that giving became her way of surviving. Every smile she offered was a quiet rebellion against despair. Every act of generosity stitched her heart back together, thread by thread. She did not know that life was preparing to test her compassion again. She did not know that one rainy afternoon, a knock at her gate would transform her loneliness into purpose. For now, she simply lived one day at a time, carrying grief with dignity and love with courage, proving that even when laughter stops, the heart can still choose to beat for others. The rain that afternoon came without warning. Dark clouds swallowed the sky and the wind howled through the narrow lanes of the village. Savitri hurried to bring in the clothes she had left drying on the line. Just as she closed the wooden shutters, she heard a faint knock at the gate. At first, she thought it was the wind. But the knock came again, soft at this time, almost hesitant. When she opened the gate, she saw a thin boy standing barefoot in the mud. His shirt clung to his small frame, soaked completely. His hair was plastered against his forehead, and his eyes carried a fear far older than his. "Age. My name is Raju," he whispered, barely audible over the rain. "I haven't eaten in 2 days." There was no dramatic pause in her heart, no suspicion, no questioning glance. Hunger was something she understood too well from her own childhood. She stepped aside immediately and said, "Come in, child." Inside, she handed him a towel and told him to sit near the stove where warmth still lingered. She moved quickly, scooping hot rice onto a plate, pouring lentils over it, and adding a small piece of pickle for taste. She placed the plate in front of him and watched quietly as he ate with trembling hands. He did not look up. He did not speak. He simply ate as though the food might disappear. When he finished, she poured him a glass of water and asked gently, "Where are your parents?" He stared at the floor. "They are gone," he said. "I sleep wherever I can. Sometimes near the tea shop, sometimes near the temple." Her chest tightened, but her voice remained calm. "You will not sleep outside tonight." That evening she laid a thin mattress on the floor beside her bed. She gave him one of her late husband's old shirts to wear. It hung loosely on him, but he smiled faintly for the first time. Before turning off the lamp, she told him a simple story about a sparrow who survived a storm by refusing to give up. Raju listened carefully. When she finished, he asked, "Will you tell me another one tomorrow?" She nodded. "Tomorrow and every day you wish to hear one." The next morning, he woke early and tried to sweep the yard before she could stop him. "You gave me food," he said shyly. "I can help." From that day on, he stayed. He fetched water from the well, gathered firewood, and even tried to tend her small vegetable patch. The villagers noticed. Some whispered that she was foolish to trust a stranger. Others warned her about responsibility and gossip. She only replied, "If a child asks for food, you do not ask for proof." Slowly, Raju began to change. The fear in his eyes softened. He laughed at her stories. He began asking questions about school, about books, about the world beyond the village. One evening, as they watched the sunset together, he said quietly, "No one has called me child in a long time." She placed her hand on his head and said, "Then get used to it." Her empty house no longer echoed. It breathed again. Plates clinked at dinner. Footsteps ran across the courtyard, and for the first time since her husband's passing, Savitri felt not just needed, but purposeful. She did not know what the future held for the boy at her table, but she knew one thing clearly. Love had knocked at her gate in the middle of a storm, and she had opened the door. As months turned into years, Raju became more than a boy seeking shelter. He became the heartbeat of Savitri's aging home. She enrolled him in the village school, using the small savings she had carefully set aside for emergencies. When the headmaster hesitated because Raju had no official documents, she stood firm. "Education should not wait for paperwork," she said quietly but firmly. Eventually, the school agreed.